The inheritance betrayal. A daughter's justice hash part one. The announcement, the words hung in the air like a death sentence, sharp and final. We've decided to cut you out of the inheritance. You've never deserved it. My father's voice rang across the private dining room with the kind of authority he'd spent a lifetime cultivating. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, everything in that opulent space simply stopped existing in normal time. The massive crystal chandelier suspended above our heads, worth more than most people's cars, seemed to freeze mid-sparkle, its hundreds of carefully cut prisms catching the soft amber light, but somehow refusing to scatter it. The classical music that had been playing softly in the background, Vivaldi, I think always Vivaldi at these pretentious affairs, faded into absolute nothingness, as if someone had reached into reality itself and turned down the volume on the entire world. I sat there completely motionless, my sterling silver fork suspended halfway between the bone china plate and my mouth, a piece of perfectly prepared filet mignon speared on its tines. I found myself staring across the length of that absurdly long mahogany table at the man who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike, who had walked me to my first day of school, and who was now looking at me with something that resembled triumph mixed with barely disguised contempt. Every face seated around that elegant table, and there were many, this was clearly meant to be a spectacle, turned toward me with expressions that ranged from smug satisfaction to barely concealed glee. Some of my relatives, I noticed with a sick feeling in my stomach, were actually smiling. Actually smiling. Not polite smiles, not awkward smiles, but genuine expressions of pleasure at my public humiliation. Around us, gathered like vultures around a fresh kill, my entire extended family had assembled for this moment. Aunts I hadn't seen in years suddenly found time in their busy schedules. No. Uncles who never returned my phone calls were somehow available tonight. Cousins who had borrowed money from me and never paid it back sat there looking judgmental. Even my grandmother, who I had always thought loved me unconditionally, occupied her seat at the table with her eyes carefully averted from mine. The restaurant my parents had chosen for this announcement was one of those places where ordinary people couldn't get a reservation without waiting months in advance and probably knowing someone on the inside. It was the kind of establishment where the waiters wore crisp white gloves and moved with practiced silence, where the menu featured no prices because if you had to ask, you clearly didn't belong there, where the wine list read like a tour of French vineyards and cost more than most people's monthly rent. They had spared absolutely no expense for this moment. My father had clearly planned this down to the smallest detail, probably spending weeks orchestrating it, imagining my reaction, savoring the anticipated sweetness of my pain and embarrassment. Did you hear me, Tara? Fuck. My father stood at the head of the table, positioned like a king addressing his court, his face flushed with expensive wine and something darker, something that looked disturbingly like triumph mixed with vindication. You're out, completely out, done, finished. My mother sat beside him in her designer dress, one that probably cost more than I made in a month, delicately dabbing at the corners of her perfectly made-up mouth with a linen napkin, trying desperately and failing miserably to hide her smile. She was enjoying this. They all were. My younger brother Kevin lounged arrogantly in his chair with a smirk plastered across his face that made my stomach physically turn. He had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and now he was reveling in my downfall with the kind of malicious joy that only a favored sibling can truly master. My cousin Jeffrey, who I had personally helped through college by tutoring him every single weekend for 2 exhausting years, giving up my own free time to ensure he passed his classes, stared at his wine glass like it held the answers to the universe. Even my Uncle Thomas, who had always made a point of saying I was his favorite niece, who had given me career advice and encouragement, raised his glass right along with everyone else, joining in the toast to my destruction without a moment's hesitation. Nothing to say, Tara. My mother asked, her voice artificially sweet, saccharine, and cloying. No tears, no begging, no dramatic scene. I picked up my wine glass slowly, examining the deep red liquid within, a very expensive Bordeaux that my father had insisted on ordering for everyone at the table, probably costing hundreds of dollars per bottle. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the complex flavors roll across my tongue, letting the silence stretch out uncomfortably, watching as confusion began to creep across their faces. Then I smiled. Congratulations, I said softly, my voice perfectly calm and controlled, setting the glass back down on the white tablecloth with barely a sound. I sincerely hope it was worth it. I stood gracefully, smoothed down my dress with both hands, and picked up my purse from the back of my chair. The table had gone completely quiet again, but this time the silence was confused, uncertain, wrong. This wasn't. They had expected tears, maybe shouting, definitely some kind of emotional scene that would give them even more ammunition to laugh about later, more evidence of my instability, more proof that they'd made the right decision. Meh. Wait, that's it. Kevin called out loudly as I turned toward the exit, his voice edged with disappointment and confusion. You're just leaving? Just walking away? I paused at the doorway, looking back over my shoulder at the assembled family members who were now staring at me with expressions ranging from bewilderment to dawning unease. My father's face had transformed from triumphant to uncertain, the satisfaction draining away and being replaced by something that looked almost like concern. My mother's carefully practiced smile had faltered, cracking at the edges. What else would you like me to do? I asked pleasantly, my voice genuinely curious, as if I were asking about the weather or making small talk. You've made your decision very clear. I accept it. I respect it. We're done here. But Paige started to say something, but I was already walking away, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a steady, confident rhythm that belied the turmoil churning inside me. As I stepped out of the private dining room and into the restaurant's main area, where normal people were having normal dinners with people who actually cared about them, I heard the confused murmuring start behind me like a wave. They didn't understand what had just happened. They were completely baffled by my reaction. They had spent weeks meticulously planning this moment, carefully orchestrating every detail, imagining my breakdown in vivid detail, practically tasting the anticipated sweetness of my pain and humiliation. My calm, dignified departure had completely stolen their satisfaction, had robbed them of the emotional climax they'd been craving. Let them wonder. Let them question. Let them realize that they no longer had any power over me. Hash part 3, the investigation begins. I handed my valet ticket to the young attendant at the front of the restaurant and waited in the cool Birmingham evening air. The restaurant was situated in the heart of the city's historic district, surrounded by ancient magnolia trees with their thick, twisted branches and elegant wrought iron lampposts that cast pools of golden light onto the brick sidewalks. It was genuinely beautiful, peaceful, serene, a strange and jarring contrast to the emotional ugliness I had just escaped. My phone buzzed insistently in my purse. I pulled it out and saw a text message from Kevin, apparently unable to let things rest even for a few minutes. Don't think you can change Dad's mind later. This decision is final. You're out forever. I deleted the message without responding, without even a moment's hesitation. Another text arrived immediately, this one from Paige. You always were so dramatic about everything, always making things about you. Deleted just as quickly. The valet brought my car around, a modest, practical sedan that I had bought myself 3 years ago, paid for entirely with my own money earned from my own job. Everything I had in this world I had earned through my own efforts and abilities. And that, fundamentally, had always been the real problem, and the real problem. I had never needed them, and they couldn't forgive me for it. I tipped the valet generously and slid behind the wheel, adjusting the mirrors and starting the engine. As I pulled slowly away from the restaurant, I caught one last glimpse of the building in my rearview mirror, all lit up and elegant against the darkening sky. Somewhere inside that beautiful facade, my family was probably already celebrating their victory, already mentally spending the inheritance money they thought they had secured by cutting me out, already congratulating themselves on putting me in my place. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. They couldn't possibly imagine the storm that was about to descend on their carefully constructed world. 2 days. That was all the time it would take to set everything in motion, just 48 hours to change everything. I drove home on complete autopilot, my hands steering and my foot operating the pedals while my mind raced ahead, already 3 steps ahead, already planning, strategizing, preparing for what came next. The anger that had been simmering just below the surface during that horrible dinner now burned with absolutely cold, crystal clear clarity. They had wanted to humiliate me publicly. They had wanted to break me, to crush my spirit, to make me beg. They thought I was weak, that I would crumble under their rejection like a house of cards in a strong wind. They thought cutting me out would destroy me. They had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, who had taught me to be ruthless in the first place. They had forgotten that I had learned from the master himself. My apartment was located in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown Birmingham. Nothing fancy or impressive, just a comfortable one-bedroom unit with enough space for me and my cat Winston, who had been my constant companion for the past 4 years. I had moved here 6 years ago when I first started working at Brighton Wealth Management, one of the city's most prestigious and respected financial advisory firms. I unlocked my door and Winston immediately materialized, winding his orange tabby body around my ankles and meowing loudly for his dinner, completely unconcerned with human drama and family betrayals. I fed him his favorite food, poured myself a generous glass of actually good wine, not the overpriced show-off bottle my father had ordered to impress people, and sat down at my small kitchen table with my laptop. The truth was that I had been expecting something like this for several months now. My parents had been dropping increasingly obvious hints, making pointed comments about family values and loyalty and knowing your place in the hierarchy. Kevin had been insufferable lately, constantly talking about his future and his plans and what he would do when the time came to inherit. Paige had gradually started treating me like I was already a stranger, someone outside the family circle. But despite all those warning signs, I had hoped desperately that I was wrong. I had hoped that despite everything, despite the years of being systematically overlooked and consistently undervalued, they would eventually see me as something more than a disappointment. I had hoped that blood would mean something in the end. That fragile hope had died tonight, executed in front of an audience. Hash part 4. The evidence. I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder I had created approximately 3 months ago. I had named it insurance, though that label felt far too generous now. It was more accurately described as evidence or proof or a detailed record of every questionable financial transaction my parents had made in the last 5 years. You see, my father thought he knew what I did for a living. He thought I was just a mediocre, unremarkable financial analyst at a medium-sized firm. He thought my job was boring, my salary modest, my career completely unremarkable and unimpressive. He absolutely loved to compare me unfavorably to Kevin, who supposedly worked in tech, though as far as I could actually tell, Kevin mostly played video games and called it user experience research. He loved to effusively praise Paige for her entrepreneurial spirit, even though her online boutique had been hemorrhaging money consistently for 3 straight years and only survived because our parents kept secretly funding it. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew because they had never bothered to actually ask about my work or take any real interest in my career, was that I wasn't just any ordinary financial analyst. I was a highly specialized forensic accountant with expertise in asset recovery and fraud detection. My supposedly medium-sized firm actually handled some of the largest, most complex fraud cases in the entire Southeast region, and I was very, very good at my job. Exceptionally good, actually. Award-winning good. 3 months ago, my mother had approached me with what she described as a minor tax question, something she needed help understanding. She had handed me a thick folder full of financial documents, trusting completely that I would do exactly what she asked and absolutely nothing more, that I would look at only what she directed me to see. What she didn't expect, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that I would recognize certain patterns immediately. The shell companies with suspicious names, the offshore accounts and tax havens, the creative bookkeeping that pushed right up against the very edge of legality and sometimes brazenly crossed over that line. I had spent the next 2 careful, methodical months quietly gathering additional information, not because I was actively planning to use it against them, but because I had learned in my profession to always be prepared, to always have documentation, to always build a complete case. My father had built his modest real estate empire through what appeared to be a combination of legitimate hard work, strategic investments, and, as it turned out, some extremely questionable and probably illegal financial practices. Now, sitting alone in my small kitchen with only Winston for company, I looked at spreadsheets and documents that told a story my family definitely didn't want anyone to know. My father had been systematically siphoning money from his business partners through complicated schemes that cleverly hid his actual profits while artificially inflating his claimed expenses. My mother had been actively using nonprofit organizations that she publicly claimed to support as her own personal piggy banks, diverting donated funds for personal use. Together, they had constructed an impressive house of cards that looked solid and successful from the outside, but would collapse spectacularly the moment anyone looked too closely at the foundation. And I was going to make absolutely certain that someone looked very, very closely indeed. Hash part 5. The journalist's Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the sunlight streaming through my windows in a way that seemed to mock the darkness of my mood. I had spent most of the previous night reviewing files, making detailed notes, and planning my next moves with the kind of careful precision my job had taught me. Winston had given up trying to lure me to bed around 2 in the morning and had simply curled up contentedly on a stack of papers beside my laptop. Now, sitting at my favorite local coffee shop with a triple shot latte that I desperately needed, I felt ready. I pulled out my phone and composed a careful message to someone I had worked with on a major fraud case about 6 months earlier. Timothy Chen was an investigative journalist for the Birmingham Tribune who specialized in financial crimes and corporate corruption. We had developed a strong working relationship during that previous case. I provided the technical expertise and documentation. He wrote the stories that brought public attention to the fraud and helped victims get justice. Hey, Timothy, I typed carefully. Remember when you said you owed me a favor? One day, I might have a story for you. Very interested? His response came back in less than 60 seconds, which told me he was already intrigued. Always interested. What are we talking about? Local real estate developer, possible fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, multiple victims. Want to meet? When and where? We arranged to meet Tuesday morning at his office downtown. That gave me one more full day to organize everything, to make absolutely certain my case was completely airtight, to verify every document and transaction. I couldn't afford any mistakes whatsoever. This had to be absolutely perfect. I spent the rest of Sunday digging even deeper into my father's financial records, following money trails through multiple accounts and shell companies. The more I looked, the worse it got, like pulling on a thread and watching an entire garment unravel. He had borrowed substantial money from business partners and never paid it back. He had taken out loans using properties he didn't fully own as collateral. He had created fake companies specifically to hide income and inflate expenses on his tax returns. Every single transaction left a paper trail, and every trail led directly back to my father. It was almost embarrassingly easy to follow once you knew what to look for. My mother was clearly complicit in everything, of course. She had signed documents, opened accounts, actively moved money around. They had built this empire of deception together over many years, and now they would fall together too. Part 6. The response and revelation Monday morning, I went to work exactly as usual, determined to maintain my normal routine despite the emotional turmoil churning inside me. My boss, Patricia, a sharp woman in her 50s with an uncanny ability to read people, noticed immediately that I seemed more intensely focused than usual. Big case, she asked, stopping by my desk with her own coffee. Personal project, I said carefully, but yes, very big. She studied me thoughtfully for a moment. Does this personal project involve that family dinner you mentioned last Friday? I had told her in passing that I was dreading a family event, though I hadn't explained why. It might, I admitted. He admitted. Patricia nodded slowly, understanding more than I'd said. If you need anything, resources, time, advice, backup, you let me know immediately. Family situations can be incredibly complicated. Family can be toxic, I corrected quietly, but thank you. I will. I worked straight through lunch, barely noticing the hours passing as I compiled and organized everything. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, I had assembled everything I needed for Timothy. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers, property records revealing fraudulent deals, and email chains between my father and his business partners that proved he knew exactly what he was doing. Contract agreements with forged signatures, tax returns that didn't remotely match actual income. It was enough evidence to send someone to prison for a very long time. That evening, Kevin called my phone. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I ignored it again. On the third call, I finally answered, annoyed. What do you want, Kevin? Jesus, took you long enough. Look, Dad wants to talk to you. I have absolutely nothing to say to Dad. Come on, Tara. Don't be so dramatic about everything. He's willing to reconsider the inheritance decision if you apologize. I actually laughed out loud at that. Apologize for what exactly? For embarrassing the family on Saturday, for leaving like that, for making a scene. I didn't make a scene, Kevin. I left quietly and with dignity. Exactly, you just left. You embarrassed Dad in front of everyone. He spent a lot of money on that dinner. He spent a lot of money to publicly humiliate me, I corrected sharply. But I appreciate the call. Tell Dad I said no thanks on the reconsideration offer. You're making a huge mistake, Kevin warned ominously. You really don't want to be on the wrong side of this family. I'm pretty sure I'm on the only right side, I said calmly and hung up. 10 minutes later, Paige texted. Kevin said you were rude to him. Why do you have to make everything so difficult? I didn't respond. Another text this time from my mother. Your father is very disappointed in your attitude. You always were ungrateful. Delete. Uncle Gerald, your parents only wanted what's best for the family. I hope you'll reconsider your selfish attitude. Delete. Aunt Carol, such a shame to see you throw away your family like this. Remember, pride comes before a fall, Tara. I stared at that last message for a long moment. Pride comes before a fall. She had absolutely no idea how prophetically right she was. She was just completely wrong about who would be doing the falling. Part 7. The story breaks Tuesday morning. I met Timothy at his office in the Tribune's building downtown, an old converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and large industrial windows. His office was on the third floor, a cluttered space filled with stacks of papers, empty coffee cups, and the persistent smell of printer ink. You look tired, he observed as I sat down across from his desk. Long weekend, I said, but worth it. I laid out everything I had brought, spreading documents and spreadsheets across his desk in organized stacks. Timothy's eyes grew progressively wider with each page I showed him, each piece of evidence I explained. Holy hell, he breathed when I finished. This is absolutely massive. How long has this been going on? At least 5 years that I can document, probably significantly longer. And the victims? Multiple business partners who lost substantial money, nonprofit organizations that received donations that were never actually delivered, investors who bought into development projects that don't actually exist. The list goes on and on. Timothy leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his already messy hair. This could potentially take down more than just your father. This could expose an entire network of corruption in Birmingham's real estate sector. I know, I said quietly. He looked at me carefully, his expression serious. These are your parents, Tara. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Once this story is published, there's no taking it back. I thought about Saturday night, the calculated cruelty, the public humiliation, the laughter, the mocking, the way every single family member had looked at me like I was nothing, like I had never mattered, like I was disposable. I'm completely sure, I said firmly. Okay then. Timothy nodded decisively. Give me 3 days. I need to verify some of this independently, talk to sources, build the story properly with multiple confirmations. Can you wait 3 days? I smiled. I've waited 29 years for this. 3 more days won't kill me. Wednesday morning started normally enough, except for the nervous energy buzzing constantly under my skin. Timothy had all my information. The investigation was officially underway. All I had to do was wait and act normal. Acting normal proved significantly harder than I'd expected. At work, I kept compulsively checking my phone for updates from Timothy. None came. He was being thorough and careful, which I absolutely appreciated professionally, but the waiting felt like torture. Around 10 o'clock, my desk phone rang. Internal call. I picked it up. Tara, could you come to my office? Patricia's voice was unusually serious. We need to talk immediately. My stomach dropped sickeningly. Had someone found out what I was doing? Had my family somehow gotten wind of my plans? I walked to Patricia's office with my mind racing through possibilities and worst case scenarios. She was sitting behind her desk, her expression completely unreadable. Close the door and sit down, she said. It did, my heart pounding. She folded her hands on her desk. I had an interesting conversation this morning with a potential client. He called asking about you specifically, wanted to know if you were available for a private consultation on some sensitive financial matters. He didn't give his real name, but the number traced back to your father's business office. Ice ran through my veins. He's checking up on me. That would be my guess. He asked detailed questions about your qualifications, your specialty areas, your recent cases. I told him you were one of our best forensic accountants, and that if he wanted to hire you, he'd need to go through proper channels and fill out our standard intake paperwork. What did he say? He hung up immediately. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me. Tara, whatever you're planning, you need to be extremely careful. If your father is sniffing around, he might suspect something. He doesn't suspect anything specific, I said with more confidence than I felt. He thinks I'm weak and insignificant. He's probably just curious about what I actually do for a living. Maybe, Patricia said, though she didn't sound convinced. But paranoid men do dangerous things. Watch your back carefully. Push Part 8. The trap and the truth the lunch meeting my father requested turned out to be exactly the trap I suspected. His attempts at reconciliation were transparently manipulative. But something happened during that confrontation that changed everything. I revealed that I knew about his crimes. The color drained from his face when I laid out what I knew. How's business, Dad? The real estate market must be challenging these days. It's fine, he said tightly. Really? Because I heard you've been having some serious financial difficulties, cash flow problems, partner disputes, that kind of thing. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Who told you that? Nobody told me anything. I figured it out myself. I'm a forensic accountant. Dad. It's literally my job to follow money trails and identify fraud. There's nothing to figure out. My business is perfectly solid. Is it? Because from what I've seen, your business is built on systematic fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. But hey, what do I know? I'm just the disappointing daughter with the boring job. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Real genuine terror. What did you just say? You heard me perfectly clearly. Tara, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing. No game, just facts. You've been stealing from your partners for years, using shell companies to hide income, taking money from nonprofits.